If you've been using SketchUp to draw detailed furniture models, including all the joinery, you know that doing the joinery is probably the most tedious part. Usually it's not difficult, but it takes a lot of time when there's a lot of geometry to do. One way you can deal with that is by the use of components, and so you keep like parts as instances of the same component. You only have to handle one of them to cut that geometry or make other modifications. Still, when it comes down to cutting mortises and grooves and things like that, dados, you need to do a little bit of work, and there are some tools that make that a lot easier. I've shown in the past a couple of different options that work using the solid tools, which are a SketchUp Pro only feature. Today I want to show you one called Bool Tools, which works in both Pro and in SketchUp Make. And I'm just going to use the trim tool, but there's other tools, the union tool, which will combine a couple of solids. The difference gives you what's left after where you put the two pieces together, replacing the intersection, splitting something to keep two solids, and then there's one that will take a set of nested components or groups and convert them all into a single component or group. In all cases, they require that the components are considered solid by SketchUp. That means there are no stray lines, every edge in the component is shared by exactly two faces, no more, no less, so that means no internal faces and no holes in surfaces. And that's generally a good idea anyway, to have solid components whenever you can. It just makes working with the SketchUp model a whole lot easier. So anyway, let's look at this. Now I'm using a model I created of it's based on a Hans Wegner bench or coffee table from the 1950s. And I've got all the parts drawn, but I haven't done any of the joinery. So you can see here that, for example, these rails need to be slotted into dados in the slats and these end pieces, and I've got loose tenons for joining the legs. Very likely this would have been joined with dowels, but I'm taking the liberty of using loose tenons here. And then I've got dowels to go into the top of the rails and the bottom of the seat slats. So here we go. This is how this works. So this is the trim tool. I'm going to get that. The tool shows a number, and down at the bottom left, in this case it says select first group or component, and I'm hovering over that so it shows that it's selected. And by the way, you can look in entity info and see that it does say that it's solid. Your first component will always be the one that's getting the work done to it, getting the trimming done, and then the second one will be the one that does the trimming. And so I'll click on that first one. The cursor switches to showing number 2, so I'll click on that. We'll give it just a second here, and it's got a bunch of geometry to process through in that because of the rounded edges. But you can see over here in my exploded view that the dado has been cut now and at both ends. And so I'll select this piece again and the other rail. And if you watch over on the left, you'll see when it processes, and that's done. We'll go ahead and do a slat. And since the slats are all instances of the same component, they all get cut in one pass that way. Alright, I want to cut some notches in the rail for the leg, and you can see over here that that's happened, and we'll do that again here. So again, the rail and the leg, and now I've got the other notch. Alright, and again, you watch these things and make sure that they stay solid. Every once in a while the tool might have a problem creating or keeping solid geometry, especially when you've got small faces from things like roundovers. I'm going to hide the legs here for a moment so that I can access the loose tenons, and I'll get the trim tool again. And so I'm going to select the stretcher and then the tool, and if you look over here on the left, you can see the mortise has been cut. And I'll repeat that process here. And so that's done. So those legs now need to get mortised. So I'll go to Edit, Unhide Last, and this time I'll just hide the stretcher. And again, you see those over here. Since all of the legs are instances of the same component, this I only need to do once. Be nice if you could do that in the shop. Whoops, let's escape. I want to do the leg. This is backwards from the tools I normally use for this sort of thing, and so it takes a little memory work to remember which one to hit. But now you can see the mortises are cut there. Alright, now I've got to cut all those dowel holes, and that would be very tedious if it weren't for this tool. What I've done is I've put all the dowels as they're all loose geometry inside the component. And even though they're not connected to each other, this is classified as a solid component by SketchUp, which means that I can use the trim tool, and I want to trim the rail with the dowels, and I can cut all of those holes in one pass. It's a lot of geometry to create, but we'll give it a moment. And still faster than doing that by hand. And you can see I've got all those dowel holes now. And we'll check it just because I like to do that, and it still shows that as a solid component. So now let's unhide. We'll do Edit, Unhide All, and I'll hide both of these rails now. Make sure we don't hit erase, although since they're components it's not that big of a deal. And get the trim tool. I'll select the end component and let that process. Of course, the tool is looking through all of those dowel shapes and all of the geometry in the end piece to see if it needs to create the intersections and remove the geometry. And so it does take a couple of seconds, but I'm giving it something a little harder to deal with than you might typically do. Just added a lot of geometry. Now I will trim the slat, and I only needed to do one of those to get the whole row of holes in that. And let's see if that still, that one doesn't show as solid now, so this is good. I can show you this. So that one's not solid, so look at this. for whatever reason, SketchUp decided it didn't want to keep these faces. No biggie. I just draw them in between the vertices, and then I'll just soften those edges again. I don't know why it did that, but I'm not going to agonize over it too much. We just keep moving. And now that shows as solid. And so I'll get the trim tool and let this go, and let's see if it does it again. Maybe it won't. It did. It probably just has to do with the size of the arcs here. These are not very large radius curves. I don't really know what's going on, but even with that in mind, the fact that I've got all of that joinery cut that quickly is pretty amazing, and it would have been a lot faster if I hadn't been talking. Anyway, I'll provide a link in the text in my blog post to Bool Tools. It isn't free, but if your time is worth anything, and you have to do this kind of stuff on a regular basis, the $20 that it costs is a drop in the bucket, and I think it's well worth it. And so maybe give that a try.